History remembers Yamata no Orochi as a monster. 8 heads, 8 tails, slain by a storm god with a sword and a trick of sake. But what if the monster was never the serpent at all? What if the creature that terrorized the Izumo Valley was not an invader, but the land itself, the river, the mountain, the old wild world that had to be surrendered, so human life could put down its first fragile roots? Now, let that question settle. Let your shoulders fall just slightly, away from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be. If it feels right, let your eyes close now, or leave them open. Either way, you are already where you need to be. Picture, if you like, a path through ancient cedars. On the slopes of the Turakami foothills, the air thick with mist, and the sound of deep water moving slowly through a narrow gorge. Somewhere ahead, a story is waiting. It has been waiting a long time. Longer than the swords. Longer than the shrines. Longer even than the name Izumo itself. This story holds something old. Something that still lingers in the iron-rich sands of the high river, and the quiet of a valley that once trembled under the weight of 8 heads. It is a story about what we lose when we tame the world, and what we carry forward in the blade of a sword. If you would like to carry this story with you beyond tonight, you are always welcome to return, to rest here, to let the telling continue. But for now, simply listen. Let the path carry you back before the hero, back before the storm, back to a time when the mountains still breathed, and the rivers still hungered, and the valleys still belonged to something that had no name. Chapter 1. The Weight of Still Weight. The Hai River had carved its gorge long before anyone thought to name it. Water moved slow and dark between black stone walls, the current barely a murmur, except where it pooled in deep basins that never saw sunlight. Ancient cedars crowded the slopes, their roots gripping rock, their branches holding the mist like something precious. This valley belonged to water and stone, and the quiet patience of trees that had stood for centuries without witness. But there were witnesses. A small family of earth deities had made their home at the river's bend, where a thatched hut sat low against the mountainside. Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi were old even by the measure of gods, their hands worn from tilling thin mountain soil, their backs bent from years of bending toward the earth. They had lived in this valley long enough to remember when the river ran clear, and the cedars were young. They had 8 daughters once. The first had been born in a season of heavy rain. The second, during a winter so cold the river froze in silence. Each arrival had filled the hut with warmth, and the scent of rice, and the sound of small feet on packed earth. The valley had been alive then, not just with birdsong and the rustle of bamboo, but with laughter that echoed off the gorge walls and came back softer. 7 of those daughters were gone now, not lost to illness or accident or the slow drift of time that eventually claims all things. They had been given one by one, year by year, to something that came from the upper gorge when the mist grew thick and the water took on a faint iron taste. The family did not speak of what took them. They only marked each absence with a stone set beside the river. 8 stones stood in a row along the bank now, gray and weathered, half hidden in river grass. 7 of them had been carved with names, small, careful characters that Tenazuchi had chiseled herself in the weeks after each daughter was taken. The 8th stone remained blank. It had been placed there the day the youngest was born, and it had waited ever since, patient as the river, patient as the thing that would one day come for her. Tenazuchi sat beside that 8th stone now, her daughter kneeling before her in the pale morning light. Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi, the last, the one who remained, kept her eyes lowered as her mother's hands moved through her long dark hair. The comb was old, carved with river reeds, its teeth worn smooth by years of this same ritual performed for 7 other heads of hair. Neither woman spoke. The river filled the silence with its slow, indifferent passage. The comb moved steadily. Tenazuchi gathered her daughter's hair into sections, braiding it with the same care she had given each of her lost girls. Her fingers did not tremble. They remembered the pattern. The white silk of Kushinada's kimono caught the gray light, the pale pink underlayer barely visible at the collar, a quiet, defiant beauty, dressed for a wedding that would never happen, or perhaps dressed for a funeral. In this valley, the two had become the same thing. Ashinazuchi watched from the doorway of the hut, his long white beard moving slightly in the damp air. He was a god of earth and stone, but grief had made him small. His brown robe hung loose on his frame, and his eyes gentle, ancient, exhausted, rested on his last daughter, as if memorizing her. He had built the 8 vats of cedar 8 years ago, after the first daughter was taken, thinking he might find a way to use them. They stood empty now beneath the lean-to, waiting. The valley had learned to hold its breath. Birds still sang in the higher branches, and the river still flowed. But there was a stillness beneath everything, a pressure that built as the mist thickened each evening, and the water took on that faint rust-red stain. The local villagers left offerings at the small stone shrines along the mountain path. Rice cakes and wild chrysanthemums placed with hurried hands and averted eyes. No one walked the gorge trail after dusk. Far above the valley, beyond the clouds that wrapped the Torakami peaks, something else was moving. It had nothing to do with the serpent. Not yet. A storm was gathering at the edge of the high plain of heaven, and at its center raged a god whose fury had finally exhausted the patience of every deity who knew him. Susanoo had been cast out. He was falling not toward any particular destination, but simply away, into the world below, trailing lightning and the smell of rain. The valley did not know he was coming. It only knew that the mist was thickening, and the river was dark, and the 8th stone was still blank. The day before the serpent was expected, Kushinada-heim walked alone to the river's edge. She knelt on the same flat stone where her sisters had knelt, one after another, and dipped her hands into the cold water. Iron-dark silt swirled around her fingers. She did not weep. She had watched 7 sisters go, and she had learned early that weeping did not change the current. It only blurred the reflection of the mountains that stood silent around her. There is no need to picture the serpent too clearly yet. It is enough to know that the valley had learned to feel its approach in the smallest signs, the way the mist clung lower to the water, the way the fish stopped rising at dusk, the way the cedars seemed to hold themselves still. The family did not speak its name. They had not spoken it aloud in 8 years. Names, they had learned, only made the hunger feel more personal. Tenazuchi set out the last of the rice cakes on the hearth that evening, arranging them with the careful precision of ritual. She had done this 7 times before. Each time, she had told herself it would be the last. Each time, the serpent had come anyway, and the daughter she had raised and combed and sung to sleep had walked to the river and not come back. Her hands moved with the memory of loss. The fire cast her shadow long against the earthen wall. Ashinazuchi sat apart, his back against the cedar post that held up the corner of the hut. He was carving something small, a charm perhaps, or a doll turning a piece of river-softened wood over and over in his weathered hands. He had carved one for each daughter before she was taken. None of them had been enough. He kept carving anyway, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant the silence would become permanent. Night came to the valley like a door closing. The mist thickened until the mountains disappeared entirely, until the hut was the only thing left in the world. Inside, Kushinada-heim lay still beneath a thin blanket, her braided hair coiled beside her on the mat. She listened to the river. It sounded different tonight, heavier, slower, as if something upstream had shifted the current. She had heard this change 7 times before. Each time, it meant the same thing. Morning broke gray and windless. The 8 sake vats stood ready beneath their shelter, their cedar planks weathered but sound, their iron bands dark with age. They had been built for this purpose, not to brew celebration, but to brew a trap. Ashinazuchi had filled them with the strongest rice wine the valley could make, brewed from mountain water and fermented in darkness. The smell of it drifted across the clearing, sweet and sharp, cutting through the mist like a promise. Kushinada Hime dressed in her white kimono and walked to the riverbank where her mother was already waiting. Tenazuchi did not speak as she adjusted her daughter's collar, smoothed the crease in the silk, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. These small gestures, the same ones she had performed for 7 other daughters, were the only goodbyes she allowed herself. To say more would be to acknowledge what came next, and what came next could not be stopped by words. The stone markers stood in their row, gray and silent. 7 carved names, 1 blank face. Kushinada Hime paused before them, her dark eyes moving across each character as if memorizing the shape of her sister's absence. She had been too young to remember the first ones clearly. Their faces had faded into the texture of old grief, but she carried their names. That was enough. That had to be enough. And then something shifted. Not in the valley. The mist still hung motionless. The river still ran dark. But in the air itself, in the pressure behind the clouds, a distant flicker of lightning, too high to be a mountain storm, too sudden to be natural. The smell of rain, not the soft, familiar rain of Izumo, but something wilder, charged with ozone and the faint burnt scent of divine anger. Far above the valley, a storm god was falling toward Earth, and he carried the sky with him. The family did not see the lightning. Their eyes were on the gorge, on the dark cleft in the mountain, where the river disappeared into shadow. The water there had gone completely still. No birds sang, no fish rose. The mist hung motionless, as if the valley itself had stopped breathing. In the hut, the fire had burned down to embers. At the riverbank, the 8th stone waited, blank and patient. And somewhere deep in the upper gorge, where the cedars grew thickest and the water ran black, something vast and ancient began to move toward the valley it had fed upon for 7 years. But before it arrived, a stranger would come, one who carried a different kind of storm and a different kind of hunger. And that stranger was already descending through the clouds, trailing lightning, heading for the river where a girl in white silk stood waiting. Chapter 2. The Mountain That Breathed. Morning came without birdsong. The mist that usually clung to the river had drawn back into the gorge overnight, leaving the valley exposed and strangely naked. Ashinazuchi stood at the doorway of the hut, his old hand pressed flat against the cedar post. He had watched 7 dawns like this one. Each time, the world had gone quiet in exactly the same way. The silence was not empty. It was full of something holding its breath. Tenazuchi did not rise from the hearth. She had learned long ago that watching the gorge would not change what emerged from it. Instead, she knelt beside the dying embers and pressed her palms together, her lips forming the same prayer she had offered 7 times before. The words had worn thin with repetition, but she spoke them anyway. Some rituals exist not to change the world, but to hold the self together while the world does what it will. Kushinada Hime walked to the river alone. The 8 stone markers were slick with cold dew, the carved names of her sisters glistening as if freshly wept. She stopped before the blank 8th stone and stood there for a long moment, her white kimono catching the gray light, her dark hair still braided from the day before. She did not pray. She simply stood the last daughter, waiting for the thing that had taken all the others. The river changed first. It had been dark and heavy all week, but now the water began to tremble, not from any wind, but from something deeper, a vibration that traveled up through the stone banks and into the roots of the cedars. Small ripples appeared on the surface, radiating outward from the mouth of the gorge, as if the river itself was flinching from whatever was moving upstream. The iron taste in the air sharpened until it coated the tongue. Then the cedars began to sway. Not the upper branches. Those remained still in the windless air. But the trunks, the the deep roots, the very ground beneath them. A low sound rolled out of the gorge, too deep to be thunder, too slow to be a rock slide. It was the sound of something vast, shifting its weight after centuries of stillness. The mountain on the eastern slope of the gorge seemed to shiver, moss and loose stones sliding from its flanks into the water below. And then the mountain moved. What had appeared to be a ridge of black stone and ancient cedar began to rise, slowly, with the terrible patience of something that had no reason to hurry. The moss covering its surface was not moss. The cedars growing from its spine were rooted not in rock, but in living scale. The ridge was a body, long and serpentine, covered in weathered bronze and dark riverstone gray, crusted with bark-like ridges where centuries of forest had grown across its back. 8 heads rose from the central mass in a slow, ceremonial unfurling. Each neck was as thick as the oldest cedars, each head angular and elegant, with narrow, noble features that held no malice and no rage, only the calm, ancient patience of a creature that had never known an enemy. Their scales were the color of moss green and charcoal, their eyes 8 pairs of brilliant amber that stared quietly at the valley they had fed upon for 7 years. No jaws opened, no fangs showed. They simply looked. There is a stillness that comes only with great age. The serpent did not lunge or thrash or roar. It rested its weight upon the stone ledge above the gorge and let the mist pool around its coils, as if settling back into a bed it had occupied for millennia. One head lowered slowly to the river and drank, its throat moving with a deep, unhurried rhythm. Another rested its chin upon the moss-covered curve of its own body. A third watched a dragonfly pass. The terror was not in motion, but in scale, in the quiet certainty that this thing could unmake the valley and would not even notice. A small bird landed on a cedar sapling growing from the serpent's brow. It preened its feathers, shook the mist from its wings, and sang a short, bright phrase into the gray morning. The serpent did not react. It had carried forests on its back for so long that birds had been nesting in its body for generations. The creature was not merely large. It was a landscape, an ecosystem, a mountain that had learned to breathe. The horror of it was inseparable from the wonder. How do you fight a mountain? How do you fear something that has become the world? Ashinazuchi watched from the doorway, his weathered face unreadable. He had seen the serpent 7 times before, but the sight never diminished. Each time, he understood anew that his daughters had not been devoured by a monster. They had been absorbed by a force of nature, the way a river swallows a stone. The serpent did not hate them. It did not even know their names. It simply came and took and retreated, as indifferent as the seasons. That was the worst part. Not the teeth, not the scales, the indifference. Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi had not moved from the riverbank. She stood with her hands folded into the sleeves of her white kimono, the braid her mother had woven still heavy against her shoulder. The serpent's amber eyes had not yet found her. They swept slowly across the valley, unhurried, as if counting familiar landmarks. She understood then that she was not a person to this creature. She was a feature of the landscape the same as the stones, the water, the cedars. The body of the serpent stretched far beyond what the eye could follow. Its immense coils disappeared into the upper gorge, wrapped around rock formations that had been shaped by its weight over centuries. The scales along its belly were a deep, angry rust red, the color of old blood and iron-rich silt, visible only when it shifted position, and the moss-covered ridges of its back gave way to the vulnerable underside. It was this red that the family had learned to watch for, the only warning that the mountain was about to move. Tenazuchi finally rose from the hearth and walked to the doorway. She stood beside Ashinazuchi, her silver-gray hair loose now, her worn robe hanging still in the windless air. She looked at the creature that had taken 7 of her daughters, and her expression did not twist with hatred. It settled into something older, a recognition that the world contained forces too vast to be blamed. The serpent was not evil. It was simply the shape the river had chosen to wear when it hungered. There is a kind of ancient stillness that asks nothing of the observer. The serpent rested on the stone ledge with the weight of a mountain range, its 8 heads slowly settling into postures of rest. One pair of amber eyes closed, then another. The creature had fed here 7 times before, and each time it had been allowed to take what it came for. It had no reason to expect anything different. Its confidence was geological. A soft breeze stirred the cedars higher up the slope, not from the gorge, but from above, from the sky beyond the clouds. It carried a faint metallic scent, a taste of ozone, as if lightning had struck somewhere far away. None of the family noticed. Their eyes were fixed on the serpent, on the slow rise and fall of its moss-covered flanks. But the air pressure had changed. Something else was coming. There is no need to picture the whole serpent at once. It is enough to know that its body carried an entire forest, that birds nested in the trees growing from its brow, that ferns and pale lichen covered the older scales along its spine. The creature was not a monster in the way the family had once believed. It was older than belief itself. It had been here before the gods named the mountains, and it would remain, they thought, long after the last prayer was spoken. Kushinada-hime turned away from the river at last. She walked back toward the hut with slow, deliberate steps, passing her parents without meeting their eyes. She had seen the serpent now. She understood what her sisters had faced. And somewhere beneath the terror quiet, almost imperceptible, a small ember of something else had begun to glow. Not hope. Something more fragile than hope. The knowledge that the serpent could be seen, and therefore could be known. The serpent remained at the ledge through the long gray afternoon, its body so still that mist began to gather once more in the hollows between its coils. The river had resumed its slow current, the iron taste fading from the water. For the first time in 8 years, the serpent had arrived, and the valley had not lost a daughter. Not yet. The family did not speak of this reprieve. To name it would be to invite its opposite. Far above the cloud-shrouded peaks, a storm was gathering strength. The exiled god had crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, his tattered silver-blue robes streaming behind him as he fell through layers of sky. He did not yet know where he was going. He only knew he was angry and alone, and that the world below was vast and green and full of things that had never heard his name. The lightning that flickered at his heels was the only light in the upper darkness. The serpent slept on its stone ledge as evening crept into the valley. Its 8 heads rested among the cedars. Indistinguishable now from the mountain itself, the family closed their door and fed the fire and did not speak of what the morning might bring. But the air had changed. The storm was closer now, carrying a different kind of hunger. Not the ancient, indifferent hunger of the land, but the sharp, desperate hunger of a god who had lost everything. And that god was already descending. But before he arrived, the valley still had one more dawn to face, and the serpent's reign, undisturbed for 7 years, had shaped more than just the river. It had shaped the silence, the soil, the slow rituals of a people who had learned to live in the shadow of a mountain that breathed. Chapter 3. The Patience of Stone. The valley had learned to measure time by the serpent's hunger, not by seasons, not by the rhythm of planting and harvest, but by the slow thickening of mist over the upper gorge, and the faint iron taste that crept into the river water each year as the cedars began to shed their oldest needles. The people of the Torikami foothills did not mark calendars. They marked the space between visits, and they knew the signs better than they knew their own children's faces. 8 years had shaped the land around the creature's presence. Paths that once led to the upper river had been abandoned, swallowed by ferns and young bamboo. The stone shrines along the mountain trails had multiplied small, gray, half hidden in the roots of cedars, each one holding a rice cake or a bundle of wild chrysanthemums left by hands that did not linger. No one walked the gorge trail after the mist began to thicken. No one needed to be told. The river itself carried the memory of the serpent. In the months after each visit, the water ran clearer, the iron silt settling into the stones of the riverbed until the entire gorge glinted with a faint, rust-red sheen. The villagers downstream knew to watch for this color. It meant the serpent had fed and retreated, and the valley was safe for another year. They drew their water carefully, filtering it through cloth, murmuring thanks to the mountain that had spared them again. The 8 sake vats stood beneath their cedar shelter, untouched since the day Ashinazuchi had built them. Rain had darkened their wooden planks to a deep gray. The iron bands had begun to rust. They had been intended as a trap, but the family had never used them. Not because they lacked the courage, but because the serpent had never given them the chance. It came too suddenly, took too quickly. The vats remained as a monument to a hope that had never been tested, slowly weathering beside the silent hut. The serpent's body had become a part of the valley's geography. On the stone ledge above the gorge, where the creature rested between feedings, the moss had grown thicker each year until the rock itself seemed upholstered in green velvet. Small ferns had taken root in the crevices of its scales, their fronds unfurling each spring as if the serpent were merely an unusually warm patch of mountainside. Birds nested in the cedars growing from its back, and their morning songs echoed across the water as if nothing were wrong. It would be easy to mistake stillness for gentleness. The serpent did not hunt with fury or chase its prey. It simply arrived, and the thing it wanted was always waiting, a daughter in white silk, standing at the river's edge as her sisters had stood before her. The family had learned that resistance was not a possibility. The serpent was too vast, too old, too woven into the fabric of the valley. To fight it would be to fight the mountain itself, and mountains do not notice the fists of small gods. There is a kind of terror that becomes routine. The villagers in the lower valley planted their rice and mended their nets and spoke of the serpent only in whispers, using names that meant the upstream one or the great stillness. They did not tell stories about it. Stories required a beginning and an end, and the serpent had neither. It simply was a condition of existence, like the rain or the cold or the weight of the mountains against the sky. The local smiths understood something the farmers did not. They worked the iron sands of the high river, the dark grains that glittered in the shallows after the serpent had retreated to its ledge. This iron was richer than any they had found elsewhere, dense and cold and strangely easy to work. They did not speak of where it came from, not openly, but when they quenched a blade in river water, they sometimes paused and looked upstream, toward the dark cleft in the mountains, and their hands grew still. Kusanagi-no had not been taken. The serpent had come, had rested on its ledge, had drunk from the river, and then it had retreated into the upper gorge, without approaching the stone markers, or the hut, or the girl in white who stood waiting. No one knew why. Tenazuchi believed the serpent had simply not yet noticed her. Ashinazuchi believed it was saving her for the next visit, as if the creature had learned to prolong the valley's dread. Kusanagi-no herself said nothing, but she kept the comb in her hair. The reprieve changed nothing and everything. The family still woke each morning to the same silence, still watched the river for the first sign of rust, still left their offerings at the stone shrines. But something had shifted in the air, a pressure, faint but growing, like the stillness before a storm. Far above the clouds, a god was falling toward earth, and he carried with him a hunger that was not the serpent's hunger. It was sharper, more desperate, and it had a name. The valley did not know this yet. It only knew that the mist had begun to thicken again, and the iron taste was returning to the water. and the long reign of the serpent was about to meet something it had never encountered before. Not a sacrifice, a storm. The annual rhythm had become a liturgy. When the first rust-colored threads appeared in the river current, the village headman would walk the boundary of the lower fields and strike a wooden staff against the earth 3 times, an old signal, older than memory, warning the valley to prepare. Mothers would bring their children indoors before dusk. Fishermen would pull their nets from the water and not return until the iron taste had faded. The ritual was not fear. It was obedience. Along the mountain path that led toward the upper gorge, the small wayside shrines had multiplied over the years until they stood every 100 paces. Gray stone, worn wood, offerings bleached pale by sun and rain. Rice cakes hardened and cracked. Wild chrysanthemums withered into brown husks. No one cleared them away. The offerings were not meant to be consumed. They were meant to be seen, a quiet statement that the valley remembered its debt and did not expect mercy. The serpent did not acknowledge these gestures. It had no priests, no cult, no name that anyone dared speak aloud. And yet the valley had built a religion around it anyway, not of worship, but of careful avoidance. A negative theology carved from the absence of daughters and the silence of the upper river. The old earth deities Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi were the closest thing to clergy, and their altar was the row of 8 stones by the water, and their sacrament was grief. In its resting state, the serpent was almost beautiful. The moss that covered its back had grown so thick that it cushioned the creature's immense coils, softening every hard edge until the body seemed to melt into the mountainside. Waterfalls of pale green lichen draped the older scales along its spine. The rust-red belly, the only part of the creature that spoke of violence, was hidden beneath the water or pressed flat against the stone ledge, visible only in glimpses when the serpent shifted its weight. The cedars that grew from the serpent's back had become a forest in miniature. Some were saplings, barely taller than a man, their roots tangled in the bark-like ridges of the creature's hide. Others were ancient, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches spreading wide enough to shade an entire section of the gorge. They had been growing for centuries, perhaps longer, and they would continue to grow long after the family below had turned to dust. The serpent was not a temporary resident. It was the valley's oldest living thing. The villagers downstream had learned to read the water the way scholars read old texts. A faint iron taste meant the serpent was stirring. A rust-red cloud meant it had moved. Clear water, cold and sweet, meant safety for a month, perhaps 2, before the cycle began again. They passed this knowledge down through generations, not in written records, but in the way a mother taught her daughter to hold the water jar, to watch the color, to trust the tongue before the eye. There is no need to imagine the serpent's hunger too vividly. It is enough to know that it came once each year, and that each year a daughter walked to the river, and that neither the serpent nor the valley questioned this arrangement. The creature was too old to be reasoned with, too vast to be moved, too woven into the iron and the water and the stone to be separated from the landscape. It was the river. The river was it, and rivers do not apologize for flooding. The smiths of Izumo worked their forges in the lower valley, where the high river slowed and spread across shallow gravel beds. They gathered the black sand in wooden pans, sifting the heavier grains from the lighter silt, and they heated it in clay furnaces until it bled into crude iron. The oldest smiths sometimes paused in their work and looked upstream, toward the dark cleft in the mountains, and they would touch the iron with something that was not quite reverence. They knew where the richness came from. They had always known. Kusanagi-no had begun to walk the riverbank each morning, past the stone markers, past the empty sake vats, to a place where the cedars opened slightly, and the view of the upper gorge was clear. She stood there in her white kimono, the same white her sisters had worn, and she watched the dark cleft where the serpent had disappeared. She was not waiting for it to return. She was learning its shape against the sky, the rhythm of its stillness, the way the mist behaved when it was near. She was studying something that had no name yet. And then one morning, the air changed. Not the mist, or the river, or the iron taste. Those remained the same, but something higher. Something in the pressure behind the clouds. A flicker of distant lightning. Too blue to be a mountain storm. The smell of ozone. Sharp and unfamiliar. Cutting through the damp cedar air. The valley had known only one kind of power for 8 years, and that power was ancient and slow and indifferent. But a different power was approaching now, fast, burning, and utterly unlike the mountain, and it was almost here. But before the storm broke, the valley still had to reckon with the thing that had shaped it, the serpent, sleeping on its ledge, dreaming of nothing, waiting to wake. Chapter 4. The Storm That Learned to Wait. He fell through the last layer of cloud and struck the earth with a sound that was not thunder. The ground near the riverbank cracked beneath him, a shallow crater filling with rain and the smell of burnt stone. When the dust settled, a young man stood at its center, his ink-black hair wild and unkempt, his silver-blue robe torn and whiplashed by the storm, his storm-gray eyes carrying both fury and a deeper, older sorrow. Ashinazuchi was the first to see him. The old earth deity had risen from the doorway at the tremor, his weathered hand braced against the cedar post, and now he stared at the stranger who had dropped out of the sky like a bolt of bad weather. The young man's lean frame was braced as if still falling, a straight sword hanging at his waist, and the air around him crackled with the residue of divine anger. The stranger did not announce himself. He simply walked toward the hut, his bare feet leaving no prints in the wet earth. And when he reached the doorway, he stopped and looked at the weeping family, the old man, the old woman with silver-gray hair, the girl in white who stood at the river's edge, and he asked, in a voice rough from disuse, why the valley smelled of iron and grief. Ashinazuchi told him, 8 daughters, 8 years. A serpent whose body was the mountain itself. As he spoke, the words came easier than they had in years, as if this wild-eyed stranger had given him permission to name what he had only ever whispered. Tenazuchi stood silent beside her husband, her hands still, her eyes never leaving the young god's face. Kusanagi-no listened from the riverbank, the comb still in her hair. Susanoo, for that was his name, though the family had never heard it, did not flinch at the telling. He had been cast out of heaven for worse than this. He had broken the sun goddess's halls, scattered her rice fields, thrown a flayed horse into her weaving hall. A serpent that ate daughters was not a terror to him. It was a purpose, something to kill, that would not strike back with divine retribution. He made his offer with the bluntness of a storm. Give him the last daughter, and he would give them the serpent's death. Ashinazuchi hesitated only long enough to meet his wife's eyes, to see the small, almost imperceptible nod that passed between them. They had buried 7 daughters. They would gamble the 8th on the word of a fallen god who smelled of lightning and broken stone. There was no other choice. The preparation began that hour. The 8 sake vats, weathered and empty for so long, were pulled from beneath their shelter and scrubbed until the pale cedar gleamed. Susanoo himself carried the first barrel of rice from the storehouse, his lean arms steady beneath the weight, and Tenazuchi, her hands remembering an older rhythm, began the long work of brewing. The smell of fermentation rose into the gray air, sweet and sharp, the scent of something new. While the sake brewed, Susanoo walked to the river's edge and stood beside Kusanagi-no. He studied her for a long moment. The white kimono, the braided hair, the dark eyes that had watched 7 sisters die and had not looked away. Then he asked her permission, not her parents', and she gave it. He took the small wooden comb carved with river reeds from her hair, spoke a word too old for the valley to remember, and she was gone, folded into the comb, light as a seed. He placed the comb in his own wild hair, tucking it among the black tangles with a gentleness that seemed to surprise even him. There is no need to understand exactly how a god transforms a girl into an object. It is enough to know that he held her carefully, and that even a storm can learn to be tender. Ashinazuchi watched from the doorway, and for the first time in 8 years, his hands did not shake. Night came, and the valley settled into a silence it had never known before. The 8 vats stood in a row beside the river, filled with sake so potent that the sweet scent drifted across the water and into the gorge. Susanoo sat on the flat stone, where 7 daughters had once knelt, his sword across his knees, the comb heavy in his hair. He did not sleep. He watched the dark cleft in the mountain, and he waited. The serpent was still asleep. The storm was awake. The brewing took 3 days. Tenazuchi worked the rice with a patience that came from years of ritual, her worn hands pressing the grains through the same motions she had used to make offerings for daughters who never returned. The sake fermented strong, stronger than any the valley had produced before, its scent drifting across the clearing and mixing with the ever-present iron in the water. Susanoo tasted it once and nodded. It was enough. On the second day, a small crowd of villagers gathered at the lower path. They did not approach the hut. They had not done so in 8 years, but they stood among the cedars and watched the stranger who had fallen from the sky. Some carried rice cakes, others iron ingots from the forges downstream. They left these offerings on the trail and retreated without a word, their faces carrying the same question they dared not voice. Susanoo ignored the villagers. He spent the days walking the gorge, studying the stone ledge where the serpent slept, memorizing the curve of the river and the angle of the cedars. He was not a strategist in the way of warriors. He thought like a storm, sudden, overwhelming, devastating. But storms can be aimed. He noted where the current ran fastest, where the mist gathered thickest, and where the 8 heads would drink when they came to the seki. On the 3rd evening, Tenazuchi brought him a bowl of rice and sat beside him on the flat stone. She did not speak of her daughters or her hopes. She simply said that the sake was ready, and that the vats had been sealed, and that the serpent would taste the sweetness before it tasted anything else. Susanoo looked at the old woman, her silver-gray hair, her tired eyes, and understood that she was not thanking him. She was giving him permission to fail. Kushinada Hime remained in the comb. Susanoo could feel its weight against his scalp, a small, constant presence that reminded him he was carrying something more fragile than a sword. He had never been gentle with anything in his life. He had raged through heaven, shattered halls, killed the sacred horse of the sun, and now he sat beside a river in the dark, protecting a wooden comb, waiting for a mountain to wake. The 8 vats were arranged in a line along the riverbank, their pale cedar gleaming in the firelight. Each one had been positioned carefully. Susanoo had marked the spots with his sword, scoring the stone where the serpents' heads would reach. The sake inside was milky white, glowing a soft, warm gold where the flames caught its surface. It looked peaceful. It was not. It was the first trap a god had ever set in this valley. There is a stillness that comes before a storm, and there is a stillness that comes before a battle. Susanoo had known both, but this was different. The air was heavy with sake and iron, and the slow, sleeping breath of the serpent on the ledge. The river ran dark, carrying rust-red silt downstream toward the forges. The cedars had stopped swaying. Even the mist seemed to be holding its breath. The trap was set, and the only thing left was the waiting. Ashinazuchi joined Susanoo at the river's edge as dawn approached. The old earth deity carried nothing, no weapon, no offering, and he sat down on the stone beside the storm god with the weariness of someone who had carried a mountain for 8 years and was finally setting it down. He did not ask if the trap would work. He simply sat and watched the gorge and let the silence hold what words could not. The first gray light of morning crept over the Torakami peaks. The 8 stone markers caught the pale glow, their carved names glistening with dew. The Sekivat stood ready. The comb rested in Susanoo's hair, holding the last daughter safe. And somewhere deep in the upper gorge, the mist began to move. Not with the wind, but with the slow, inevitable stirring of something vast and ancient and hungry, waking from its long rest. Susanoo rose to his feet. His hand found the hilt of his sword, the indigo cord wrapping the grip worn smooth by use. His storm-gray eyes fixed on the dark cleft in the mountain, and his lips moved not in prayer, but in the half-formed words of a god who had spent his life breaking things and was finally learning to protect one. The sake waited. The serpent stirred. The storm was about to meet the mountain, and in the comb, Kusanagi-him held still, trusting a fallen god who had never before been trusted with anything. But the descent into the gorge would require more than trust. It would require iron and sake, and the patience of a storm that had learned to hold its lightning until exactly the right moment. And that moment was almost here. Chapter 5. The Gift Inside the Mountain. Dusk came early to the gorge, the mist thickening until the cedars on the upper slopes were only gray ghosts against a darker sky. The river had stopped its usual murmur, flattening to a black mirror that reflected nothing. Inside the hut, Tenazuchi fed the fire without looking at it, her hands moving by memory. Ashinazuchi stood at the threshold, his old eyes fixed on the dark cleft where the mist was beginning to move against the wind. The first sign was not a sound but a pressure, a low, subsonic thrum that vibrated up through the river stones and into the soles of Susanoo's feet. He stood on the flat rock, the sake vats glowing faintly in the last gray light. The comb in his hair felt warm, as if Kusanagi-hime were holding her breath. He did not draw his sword. Not yet. The trap would only work if the serpent felt safe. The mist parted, and the 8 heads emerged. Not with violence, but with a slow, ceremonial grace that was almost beautiful. Each one was enormous, angular and noble, their moss-green and charcoal scales glistening with moisture. Their amber eyes, calm and ancient, swept across the riverbank and found the vats. The scent of sake had reached them. One had tilted, curious as a cat. Another drank the air. They came to the sake like pilgrims to a shrine. The first head dipped to the nearest vat, its great jaw working softly as the milky white liquid disappeared. Then the second head followed. Then the third. The drinking was not frenzied or desperate. It was slow, rhythmic, almost reverent. The serpent had never been offered anything before. It had always simply taken. This was different. This was a gift. Susanoo watched from the shadows of the cedar grove, his storm-gray eyes tracking each head as it drank. He counted them. 8 vats, 8 heads, and he did not move. The sake was stronger than anything the serpent had ever tasted, brewed by a woman who had poured 8 years of grief into the rice. One by one, the amber eyes began to cloud. One by one, the great necks grew heavy. The mountain was growing still. The serpent's collapse was not a fall. It was a slow, monumental settling, as if the earth itself had decided to rest. The heads lowered to the stone, jaws slack, eyes closing with the weight of centuries. The immense coils, covered in moss and cedar and the nests of birds, relaxed into the riverbed with a sigh that sent ripples across the water. The serpent was not dead. It was dreaming a dream deeper than any it had known in its ancient waking life. There is a stillness that follows the end of a long fear. Ashinazuchi felt it first, his old hand releasing its grip on the doorpost. Tenazuchi let out a breath she had been holding for 8 years. The birds in the upper cedars began to sing again, tentative and soft, as if testing the silence. The serpent slept on, its 8 heads resting among the vats, the last of the sake pooling in the hollow of one great jaw. Susanoo stepped into the river. The water was cold, colder than he had expected, and it rose quickly to his waist, soaking his torn robe. He did not hurry. The serpent would not wake, not from this sleep. But some part of him understood that the killing of something so old should not be rushed. It should be done carefully, with attention, the way one closes the eyes of the dead. His hand found the hilt of his sword, the indigo cord worn smooth. He began with the tails. The Kojiki records this detail with a kind of quiet precision. The storm god worked from the tail end, methodically cutting the great body where it lay half submerged in the river. The blade, a long straight double-edged sword of dark iron, passed through scale and moss and ancient hide, with an ease that surprised him. The serpent did not resist. It did not wake. It simply dissolved, piece by piece, into the landscape it had once ruled. The water around him grew dark with iron. The rust-red silt that the villagers had learned to read in the river current now rose in clouds from the serpent's body, staining Susanoo's robe and hands and the pale cedar of the vats. It was not blood, not exactly. It was the essence of the mountain, the mineral richness that had made Izumo's forges famous, released back into the water that had carried it for centuries. The serpent was returning to the land. He worked through the deepest hour of the night, when the mist hung so thick that even the cedars seemed to lean closer, watching. The blade in his hands did not falter. Each cut was deliberate, unhurried, a storm god learning patience in the cold river. The serpent's body gave way like old wood, scale and moss and ancient hide parting in silence. The water carried the rust-dark stain downstream, past the stone markers, past the silent hut. Then the sword struck something that was not flesh. The vibration ran up the blade and into Susanoo's hands, a ringing note that cut through the stillness like a struck bell. He stopped. The water around him had gone dark with iron, but beneath the surface, at the center of the serpent's middle tail, something was glowing, a pale, cold light that had never seen the sky. He reached into the river with his free hand, the water numbing his fingers, and closed them around a hilt. The sword came free without resistance, as if it had been waiting. Its blade was long and straight, forged from a steel so pale it seemed to hold moonlight within its edges. No blood clung to it, no rust, no tarnish, no sign that it had ever lain inside a living body. It was not a weapon. It was a gift. There is no need to imagine how it felt to hold that light. It is enough to know that even a storm god, standing waist-deep in the dark water of a dying river, can be rendered silent by something beautiful. Susanoo held the blade up to the sky, and the mist parted just enough for the stars to find it. The sword drank the starlight and gave nothing back. It was the sharpest thing the world had ever made, and he had found it inside a mountain. He did not rush the rest of the work. The discovery of the sword had changed the texture of the night. What had been a killing was now something closer to an unburial. He continued through the remaining tales, his movements still careful, still reverent. The serpent's great heads lay motionless on the stone, their amber eyes closed, their jaws slack. Whatever dreams they had carried into the sake, they did not carry out. The serpent's body settled into the riverbed, with the weight of a mountain returning to sleep. What had been a living landscape, moss and cedar, and the slow breathing bulk of ancient coils, was now only landscape again. The iron-rich silt drifted downstream in heavy clouds, darkening the shallows where the villagers would find it in the morning. The serpent was gone, but the river remembered. The river would always remember. Susanoo waded to shore, the water falling from his robe in heavy sheets. In one hand, he carried his own sword, dark and worn. In the other, the new blade luminous, impossibly light, still glowing with that faint inner radiance. The wooden comb in his hair was warm against his scalp. He had promised to protect the last daughter, and he had. He stood on the bank and looked toward the hut, where two old gods were waiting to see if the world had changed. Ashinazuchi was the first to move. He walked down to the river's edge, his bare feet finding the familiar stones without thought, and he stopped before the young storm god who had fallen out of the sky. He did not bow. He simply looked at the sword and at the dark water, and at the 8 heads resting on the stone. And then he put his weathered hand on Susanoo's shoulder and left it there. No words passed between them. None were needed. Tenazuchi came next, her silver gray hair loose around her tired face, her worn robe trailing in the wet grass. She knelt at the river's edge and cupped the dark water in her hands, the same water that had carried 7 daughters away, and she let it run through her fingers. Then she rose, and she looked at the comb in Susanoo's hair, and for the first time in 8 years, the lines around her eyes softened into something that was not grief. The stars emerged fully as the mist began to clear, their light falling cold and silver across the valley. Susanoo walked to the hut, the Kusanagi blade resting across his shoulder, the comb still tucked among his wild black tangles. Behind him, the river flowed dark with iron, carrying the memory of the serpent toward the distant forges. Ahead of him, the door stood open, and inside the comb, Kusanagi-hime stirred the last daughter, still waiting to be returned. The serpent was dead, but its bloodline was already seeping into the land, into the water, into the steel that would one day shape an empire, and the sword that had been hidden inside it would outlast everything. But that was a story for the morning. For now, there was only the long walk home. Chapter 6. The Iron That Remained. Dawn broke clean over the Torakami foothills, the mist retreating for the first time in 8 years, to reveal a sky that was soft and pale and entirely empty of threat. The river ran dark with iron, but quieter now, its current no longer carrying the subsonic weight of something vast shifting upstream. Birds that had not sung in the upper gorge since before the first daughter was taken began to call again, tentative and bright, as if testing the world. Susanoo stood at the river's edge and drew the small wooden comb from his hair. He held it in his scarred palm for a long moment, the carved river reeds catching the early light. And then he spoke the word quiet, ancient, private. The comb shimmered, unfolded, and Kusanagi-hime stood before him in her white kimono, her dark hair still braided, her dark eyes blinking at a valley that no longer held a serpent. Tenazuchi did not weep. She had no tears left after 8 years of daughters lost and rituals kept and fires fed in the dark. Instead, she walked to her last child and took her face in both weathered hands, the way she had done before the braiding, before the stone markers, before all of it. Ashinazuchi stood apart, his old hand resting on the blank 8th stone. For the first time, it felt like a memorial rather than a countdown. The serpent's body had begun its return to the land. The great coils that had rested on the stone ledge were dissolving, not rotting, but settling, the ancient hide softening into the riverbed, the moss and cedars that had grown upon it for centuries now floating free in the current. The iron-rich silt that had been its blood drifted downstream in clouds of deep rust, staining the shallows where the village women would later gather to draw water. There is no need to mourn the serpent too deeply. It is enough to know that something ancient had passed from the world, and that the valley felt its absence in the way the river ran clearer each day, in the way the cedars on the upper slopes no longer trembled at dusk. The iron taste faded slowly, until only the smiths downstream, sifting the black sand from the shallows, could taste what remained, and they would never speak of it aloud. By the 3rd day, Susanoo had begun to build. He felled young cedars from the lower slopes, not the ancient ones that had shaded the serpent, but trees that had grown in the years of fear, and he shaped them with his own hands, fitting beam to post with the same methodical patience he had learned in the river. The palace at Suga rose beside the high river, not grand, but solid, a home for a storm god who had decided to stay. The villagers came up from the lower valley when they heard the hammering. They brought rice and sake and bundles of fresh bamboo, and they stood at the edge of the clearing with the same cautious hope they had worn when they left offerings on the mountain path. Some of the younger ones had never seen the hut without dread pressing on its thatch, They watched Susanoo work wild hair, torn robe, the luminous blade resting against a cedar post, and they began to believe. Kusanagi-no married him beside the river, in the same white kimono she had worn for her sisters, but with fresh, wild chrysanthemums woven into her braid. Tenazuchi performed the ritual, her voice thin but steady, and Ashinazuchi offered sake from the last of the vats, the same sake that had felled a mountain. There were no priests, no shrines, only the river, the cedars, the 8 stone markers standing witness, and a comb returned to the hair of the girl who had worn it first. That evening, Tenazuchi lit a new fire in the hearth. It was not a vigil fire, the kind she had fed through 8 years of waiting. It was a cooking fire, a warmth fire, a fire that expected morning to come. She knelt before it, her silver gray hair loose, her worn robe smelling of fresh rice, and she watched the flames catch the dry kindling with something that was almost peace. Outside, the river ran clear. Inside, the hut was full of quiet voices. Ashinazuchi walked alone to the river's edge as dusk gathered. He stood before the row of stones, 7 carved names, 1 blank face, and he touched each one in turn, his rough palm lingering on the cold gray surface. The 8th stone, the one that had waited so long for a name it never received, was no longer a threat. It was a monument to something that had almost happened, but did not. The old god knelt, and he stayed there until the stars came out, keeping a vigil that was finally his own to end. Kusanagi-no learned to walk the riverbank without fear. Each morning she passed the 8 stone markers, pausing sometimes to brush a fallen leaf from the carved names. And she continued to the place where the cedars opened and the view of the upper gorge was clear. The dark cleft held no terror now, only the memory of a mountain that had once breathed. She still wore the white kimono, but she had added a sash of pale gold, a color the valley had almost forgotten. Susanoo did not stay long in the palace at Suga. A storm, even one that has learned patience, must eventually move. He took the luminous blade from its resting place, wrapped it in white cloth, and began the long journey back toward the high plain of heaven. The calm remained in Kusanagi-no's hair, where it belonged. Some gifts are meant to be returned. Some gifts are meant to be given away. The presentation of the sword to Amaterasu was not witnessed by the valley, but its echo reached them across the years. The Kojiki records the moment with simplicity. The storm god offered the blade to his sister, the sun goddess, a gesture of reconciliation after an exile that had reshaped the world below. She accepted. The sword that had been hidden inside a serpent's tail became one of the 3 sacred treasures, and the wild young man who had found it began, slowly, to be something more than a disaster. Downstream, the smiths of Izumo worked their forges, as they always had, but the iron they drew from the river in the months after the serpent's death was richer than any they had known. The black sand glittered darker, heated faster, folded with fewer cracks. The oldest smiths said nothing. They simply ran their thumbs along the finished blades and looked upstream, toward the dark cleft, with the quiet reverence of men who understood that the finest steel sometimes carries a ghost. The valley changed quickly once fear was lifted. New paths were cut to the upper river, passing the old wayside shrines that no longer needed offerings. Young couples built huts on the sunny slopes, where cedars had been felled. Children who had spent their lives indoors at dusk ran down to the water to catch fireflies, their laughter carrying across the current that had once run dark with iron and dread. The serpent's reign had shaped the land, but its absence shaped it more. Tenazuchi continued to visit the stone markers each morning, long after the danger had passed. She did not pray or weep or leave offerings. She simply stood before the 7 carved names, with her silver gray hair loose and her worn hands folded, and she let the river speak the names she no longer needed to say aloud. There is a kind of grief that becomes a companion. It asks nothing. It simply stays, and in staying, becomes a form of love. The sword Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi left Izumo and entered history. It passed from Susanoo to Amaterasu, from Amaterasu to the imperial line, from shrine to shrine, until it came to rest at Atsuda, where it remains, though no living eye has seen it, wrapped in silk and silence. The serpent that had been a mountain, that had drunk sake and dreamed of nothing, had carried within its body the blade that would outlast every god who had ever feared it. The valley did not speak of this. It simply remembered. Susanoo returned to Izumo, though not to stay. He came and went like weather, building shrines and fathering dynasties, his wild hair graying, his storm-gray eyes softening with the years. Kushinada-hime bore children who bore children, and the line of the storm god and the last daughter spread through the province like the roots of the ancient cedars. The palace at Suga weathered and settled. The Sakavats were repurposed for festivals. The serpent became a story, and then a myth, and then something older than both. The river carried the iron downstream for decades, perhaps centuries, until the black sand became simply a feature of the region, a natural resource, a gift of the mountains, a foundation for the finest swords in the empire. No one spoke of the serpent when they quenched a blade, but the smiths still paused sometimes, their hammers hovering above the steel, and looked toward the dark cleft in the Torakami peaks. The water remembered. The iron remembered. They remembered. The serpent was dead. The valley was safe. The sword was on its way to becoming legend. And yet, the landscape itself, the iron-rich soil, the river-carved gorge, the cedars that still grew thick on the upper slopes, held the shape of what had been. Every settled land was once a wilderness that had to be lost. Every sword drawn in defense of an empire was forged from the blood of something ancient and untamed. The story of Yamata no Orochi did not end with its death. It seeped into the water, the steel, the memory of a valley that had learned to live beside a mountain that breathed. And that memory, like the iron, would never fully wash away. But the meaning of that memory, the truth of what the serpent had really been, and what it still represented, was something the valley could only begin to understand. That understanding would come later, in the quiet centuries that followed, when the shrines had been built, and the chronicles had been written, and the high river still flowed, as it always had, through the dark cleft where a mountain once moved. Chapter 7. The River Remembers. The serpent was a map. The 8 heads that drank sake from cedar vats were the 8 tributaries of the Hai River, branching through the Chugoku Mountains like arteries from a stone heart. Every year, the rains came and the river rose, and the waters spread across the flatlands, drowning the young rice paddies, scouring the soil, reminding the people of Izumo that the land belonged to forces far older than cultivation. The flood did not hate the farmers. It simply moved as it always had. Archaeologists have traced the ancient riverbeds, now dry or diverted, and found the bones of villages buried in silt. The Torakami foothills still bear the scars of landslides, and the smooth-worn channels where water once roared through narrow gorges. The serpent was not a fantasy. It was a memory, a way of describing a flood so vast and so regular that it became a personality, a hunger, a living thing that demanded sacrifice to be appeased. The iron sands of the Hai River gave the myth its second life. The blood of the serpent, rust-red and heavy, settled into the riverbed and became the foundation of Japan's oldest sword-making tradition. The smiths of Izumo did not need the kojiki to tell them their steel was special. They could feel it in the weight of the ore, the way it folded under the hammer, the edge it held against all reason. Somewhere in the dark water, they knew, a mountain had bled. The sword Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi rests now at Atsuda Shrine in Nagoya, wrapped in silk and sealed from human sight. No photograph exists of it, No scholar has examined it. It is a sacred absence, a blade that was pulled from a serpent's tail and became one of the 3 imperial regalia, the symbol of legitimate rule, the sharp edge of the Yamato state. The wilderness that had to be killed became the authority that could not be questioned. The taming of the Hichai River took centuries. Levees were raised, channels were cut. The floodplain was slowly transformed into a quilt of rice paddies that fed generations. The priests who performed the first rituals of land openings spoke the name of Susanoo, the storm god who had wrestled the river into submission. They did not speak the name of the serpent. That name belonged to the old world, the world before order, and it was not safe to invoke what you had replaced. Today, the river flows quiet through Shimane Prefecture. Tourists visit the Izumo Taisha Shrine, not far from where the serpent was said to have slept, and they photograph the ancient cedars and the mist on the mountains. The iron sands are still gathered. The swords are still forged, though the smiths now work for art rather than war. The landscape holds the memory without needing to speak it. The river still carries the faintest taste of iron. Every settled land was once a wilderness that someone had to lose. This is the truth that ancient flood myths carry across cultures. The Babylonian Tiamat, the Egyptian Apep, the Vedic Vitra, all great serpents slain by younger gods who wanted to build a world of boundaries and laws. The serpent is always the old chaos. The hero is always the new order. And the blood of the serpent always becomes the foundation of something the hero's descendants will call civilization. But the loss was real. The wild river that could not be predicted. The mountain that could not be mapped. The creature that did not distinguish between a daughter and a deer. These were not evils. They were the conditions of existence in a world that had not yet been shaped to human need. To mourn the serpent is not to wish it back. It is simply to acknowledge that every gain is also a grief, and that the land remembers what it costs to make it safe. The Kusanagi sword is the tangible proof of this exchange. It was not forged by human hands. It was found inside the body of the old world, gleaming and perfect, as if the wilderness had been waiting to yield something sacred. The imperial regalia, the mirror, the jewel, the sword are objects of memory as much as power. The sword is the memory of the serpent. The edge that divides order from chaos was once chaos's own hidden heart. There is no need to travel to Izumo to feel this. It is enough to sit beside any river that has been dammed, any valley that has been farmed, any forest that has been cut back and replaced with straight rows of houses. The old wilderness is still there, beneath the asphalt, beneath the irrigation channels, beneath the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. The serpent is gone, and yet the serpent is everywhere. The Hiei River still flows through the same dark gorge, though its banks are lined now with riprap and the occasional bridge. The cedars that once trembled at the serpent's approach shade walking paths and temple grounds. Mist still gathers in the hollows on autumn mornings, thick and white, and for a moment the shape of the valley looks exactly as it did when the mountain still breathed. The landscape has not forgotten. It has simply grown quiet. The sword, Kusanagi-no-Tsurugi, remains unseen. Pilgrims visit Atsuda Shrine and bow before a locked sanctuary, offering prayers to a blade that may no longer exist, or may exist exactly as it did when Susanoo pulled it from the tail, luminous and cold. The imperial household has never displayed it. Scholars debate whether the original was lost at sea during the Genpei War. The mystery itself is a form of preservation. Some things are more powerful when hidden. The 8 tributaries of the Hiei River are still there, though several have been straightened and 2 have been dammed. They fan out across the Izumo plain like the necks of a great serpent, branching and rejoining, carrying the iron-rich silt that still makes the region's soil dark and fertile. Maps of the watershed bear an uncanny resemblance to ancient scroll paintings of the 8-headed beast. The cartographers see drainage patterns. The mythographers see a memory. In the forges of Shemaine, craftsmen still smelt iron sand in the traditional way, building clay furnaces and feeding them charcoal for 3 days and 3 nights. The steel they produce is called tamahagane, jewel steel, and it is reserved for the finest blades. When asked why the iron of Izumo is so special, the smiths give technical answers about geology and smelting temperature. But some of them, the older ones, will pause before answering, and then they will smile and say nothing. The mist that pools in the upper gorge each autumn is not supernatural. It forms when warm, moisture-laden air from the Sea of Japan rises against the cold slopes of the Chigoku Mountains, condensing into the thick white fog that clings to the cedars and stills the river's surface. The ancient inhabitants of Izumo did not know the physics. They knew only that when the mist thickened, something was coming. They were right. They were simply describing the same truth in different words. What we call a monster is often the shape the world wears before we learn to see it clearly. The serpent was never a creature of malice. It was a river system that flooded every year, that washed away crops and homes, that demanded from the perspective of those who lived beside it a terrible and regular sacrifice. To name it Orochi was to give it a face. To give it a face was to make it possible to fight. The story was a survival strategy. There is no need to travel to Izumo to understand this. It is enough to sit beside any river that has been tamed, any forest that has been cleared, any stretch of coastline where the sea still rises against the seawall. The old wilderness is never truly gone. It sleeps beneath the bridges and the rice paddies, beneath the shrines and the highways. And sometimes, when the mist rolls in and the water rises, it stirs. The listener does not need to imagine this. It is already true. The 7 daughters were not forgotten. Their names are not recorded in the Kojiki or the Nihon Shoki. The chronicles were concerned with gods and emperors, not with the daughters of minor earth deities. But the valley remembered them. The 8 stone markers may have been lost to time, but the impulse that raised them persists. Every shrine to a lost child, every roadside memorial, every small gray stone set beside a river is a descendant of that first, unrecorded grief. The serpent's blood became iron. The iron became swords. The swords became the instruments of a unified Japan, forged in the fires of the same landscape that had once been a wilderness too dangerous to settle. The Kusanagi sword, hidden in its shrine, is not merely a relic. It is a covenant, a promise that the old chaos can be transformed into something that protects rather than devours. And yet, the iron still tastes of the river. The river still remembers the mountain. The story of Yamata no Orochi does not end here. It never ended. It seeped into the water, the soil, the steel, the memory of a valley that learned to live beside something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent. The serpent was not a monster. It was the land before human hands touched it. And though the land has been reshaped, terraced, bridged, irrigated, tamed, it still carries the serpent's shape in its bones. Every map of the high river is a portrait of the creature that died so the valley could live. Every sword forged from the black sand holds a ghost in its edge. And every autumn, when the mist comes down from the mountains, the old world rises again, not to devour, but to be remembered. The storm is past. The sake is dried in the vats. The sword rests in darkness. But the river flows on, and as long as it flows, the serpent is not entirely gone. It is only sleeping the way mountains sleep, the way iron sleeps in the stone, the way ancient stories sleep in the quiet minds of those who still remember to listen.